All right. We are live, I think. Welcome everybody to the Real Crusades History Christmas reunion stream. My name is Jay Stephen. I'm here with my good friends Helena Schrader and Rand. Helena, how are you doing?
We're great, thank you. And hello to everybody.
All right. And Rand, how are you doing?
Pretty good. It's been a while since we did this. Good to be back.
I know. This is really cool. So yeah, I just wanted to do this. I know that everybody's been busy and there's been a lot going on, but this is kind of a good chance to kind of get everybody together and discuss what's been going on during the year, and maybe do some Q&A with the crowd out there, everybody who follows Real Crusades history. So feel free, everybody, to come up with some questions. For those of you who have been around for a while, this is kind of our usual panel that we, back in the day, would assemble for different topics. And hopefully, we'll do some of that again soon. I even brought my my Assassin's Creed Knights Templar cross out for this one. So just
I've got one. Yeah, I'm wearing just the cross of Jerusalem here.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, and apparently, that the Jerusalem cross is becoming very popular, even among our politicians these days. So that's we know that's going on too. So.
I've noticed that. Yeah, you see it a lot more often now.
Yeah. So anyway, as you guys can also see, we've got the this cool little green screen feature that I am trying out here that StreamYards has. You can kind of see that's the painting of the commemoration of Godfrey of Bouillon as the defender of the Holy Sepulchre back there. I forget who the artist is, but that's one of those great 19th century paintings. So I love those. I don't know about you guys, but
next.
So anyway, let's start with Helena in terms of what's been going on. I know that I recently read Helena's newest book here, which is The Powerful. I'm gonna have to find an actual. It's so weird. This is an AI green screen, so it just like it detects a human form. So okay, if I bring it back like this, yeah, you can see it. This is Helena's new book for everybody who hasn't seen this yet. This is a really, really interesting book that she did about the various noble women and important women of the Crusader states. So yeah, Helena, you did release that. How's that been going?
Not so well. I noticed none of you have put up reviews. Scott did for me just recently, but yeah, it'd be helpful if people who like it read it and put up reviews, because that's Amazon's gotten into it's all automated now, and the number of reviews makes a huge difference of whether you're being shown or you come up on searches, etc. So it's also, I'm going to be very blunt about it, people buy reviews. It's not a very it's not a level playing field right now, but it would really help if people who do read it and like it say something nice about it. The thing, as I say, I still think that the book about the kingdoms of the crossroads of the civilization is a more comprehensive history. This focuses only on the women. That's something I traditionally haven't done. It's sort of a feminist view of history. It was commissioned by Pen and Sword in the UK, but at the same time, because I was forced to do it that way, it made me go back and look at some of the sources, and it was fascinating how the women are actually there. In other words, the women are playing a very active role in the Crusades, an astonishingly active role, and they're mentioned, but they tend to, when people tell the stories of the Crusades, focus on the battles and focus on the men, although the women are actually backing it up. Financial, huge amount. I mean, one of the most interesting chapters was the degree to which women patrons had financed, buildings of towers, ships, and other things, and how important that was. It is good to focus sometimes on a subset of the total, because, as I say, otherwise it gets lost in the overview. So I think it was a fun exercise for me. It was an interesting, and it exposed some things I had just overlooked myself. And I think for anyone who's interested in the Crusades, it's a good supplementary work. again, if the first thing you should look at would be the more comprehensive work, My Kingdoms at the Crossroads of Civilizations. But as a yeah, what do you think, Jay Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really interesting. I mean, I've always been interested in, the various female figures in the history of the Crusades, and there's a lot of them from the Crusader states, more than probably a lot of people would know. I mean, you've got important queens like Queen Melisende and Queen Morphia, both of whom you do discuss, but also kind of like what you're talking about, the role that women did play in Latin Christian society. I mean, it was not sort of this kind of oppressed sort of scenes type role that, we might be told in popular culture. I mean, it really was, they were prominent in the politics. They did have a strong role in government. They had a role in, inheriting lands, inheriting titles, inheriting lordships.
Yeah, especially the women from the nobility and the aristocracy. Like they had they played a huge role in not just the Crusader states, but even just Christendom as a whole during the medieval period. And yeah, so it's very unfortunate how it's often portrayed in modern culture because it's very inaccurate.
Yeah, but the problem is most people think of history as lineal. They tend to think that because women were not powerful in the 19th century, they were less powerful in the 18th, and then they were, of course, they were just chattels. You think women were just chattels in the Middle Ages? Well, they weren't. They were far more empowered in the 12th and 13th century than they were in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. You don't have women achieving the same level of political power and empowerment and education until the 20th century, as they had in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, which was more of an apex of women's empowerment. And that's, as I say, I compare that, of course, obviously the Muslim women, I compare to what women had been under Roman law, which was appalling. And then, of course, how they get the introduction, the love of Rome that leads in the so-called Renaissance leads to a complete curtailment of women's rights in the so-called Renaissance. And so that the medieval period, but particularly, I say, the 12th, 13th, 11th, 12th, and 13th century, was a period in which women played a very important role. And yes, you say that obviously in the nobility was most powerful, but that's true of men and women. The point, if you look at women in the middle classes, they had the same levels of power as the men in the middle classes. In other words, they could be guild masters. They sat in the guilds. They determined rights. They inherited fortunes. They could be traded. They were skilled. Women were qualified in practically every trade, including arms, armorers and blacksmiths, and yes, there were certain trades like baking in which women were more prominent, but there were even other roles, as I say, carpentry, etc. Women could qualify and become masters in practically every trade, and they did in the Middle Ages. And that means that they could have their own businesses, and they often did. Sometimes they supported their husband in his business, but very often women had their femme sole. They had their own businesses. And they had their own apprentices, and they had their own source of income. That is incredibly empowering. It gives women the right, to if you control money, you're always in a better position. Yeah. And as I say, it was feudal.
I was just going to jump in. You brought up a very good point, and it reminded me of, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Modern History TV, which is very unfortunately named because he only talks about medieval stuff, but he's a former professional jouster, Sir Jason. He lives over in England. And he has a YouTube channel now where he just talks about just like medieval everyday life topics. And he's really, really fascinating because he's a really cool guy. And he actually trains with jousting horses and things like that. It really gives you that kind of hands-on feel of, what it would have been like. But he actually did a video recently on the difference between like inns and taverns and things like that. And he talked about how, at least in medieval England, the people who were mostly in charge of the brewing industry were women. They were the brew wives, and they were the ones brewing the ales that they would serve at these taverns, and 9 times out of 10, it was the women who ran the business for it. And that was, in fact, there were even laws passed in Parliament during the 13 and 1400s that actually made, kind of like standardized practices and things like that. And that's where there's a whole culture. There was a whole culture up until really up until about the 18th century of women were the ones running like taverns and inns. So it just, when you said that, it reminded me of that. And it's just one of those little vignettes
but like,
people don't know.
Women, as you were talking about standards, like also there was very clear laws against malpractice in medicine. There were people did have qualifications before, again, they started going to university, but in most of the early Middle Ages, doctors or apothecaries and physicians learned their trade just like everybody else as apprentices, and women could apprentice to doctors. So you had physicians and apothecaries that were women. Louis IX goes on a crusade with a woman doctor in his train. So women were physicians, and that means they were also going through this process of having to qualify and meet qualifications, etc. And then you shift to the universities. And once medicine became something which required a university, once universities get established, and then they took over the qualifying doctors, that was when women were excluded. But throughout the earlier Middle Ages, I say right through, as you say, to the 15th century almost, women were actually also very involved in medicine and all sorts of trades. So that's at the middle class, and I say in the upper class, as long as they could inherit. There are studies that show that 1/3 of the feudal lords in the county of Champagne were held by women. That's shifting every time, because then they have a son and the son takes over, and then he dies, and then maybe the widow or whatever. But at any one time, or during, that 1/3 of the feudal fiefs would be held by women. And if a woman held a fief, and this was true in the Crusader states, she sat in Parliament for that seat. So there's the Women's Parliament, which was in Greece. It was in Frankish Greece during the short period when the Franks controlled Greece, when so many of the feudal lords were either dead or in prison after a lost battle to the Byzantines, that the Parliament consisted of all women except for 2 men. But that they were the feudal lords representing the fiefdoms, and they voted on the issue of whether they would accept a treaty from the Byzantine Emperor, and they accepted it, accept the terms of it. That's complete equality before the law. We're still in a feudal system, where you don't have, these people are not being elected, they're inheriting it. But if a woman inherited the fief and she held the fief in her own right, or by right of being the widow for a minor heir, she had all of the same privileges as a male.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. Just for me, the book itself kind of made me think about the nature of power itself. Like, talking about, the title of the book is The Powerful Women of Outremer. And, I don't want to get too philosophical, but like the reality is that individual human beings are powerless. I mean, we're we're feeble. I think the ancient Greeks had this saying that was like, one man is no man. It's actually one of my favorite sayings. It's like the idea that and it's kind of interesting because I think it kind of contrasts with this ideal that we have in America, or, in the modern kind of Anglosphere of, the powerful individual who kind of changes everything, like the individualism. Like in our movies, our action movies, it'll be like Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's one guy, he jumps in there and he blows everybody up with his, machine guns. But that's not really how power works. Power isn't like one Superman. It comes from groups. It comes from people acting together. And like, that's what your book kind of really brings up is the elements that aristocratic women in the Latin East, the role that they played within this larger group, which was, the states, or the aristocracy, the Frankish elite, and how they carried out their power in the Crusader states. But the point being that that's really where power comes from. Is it comes from organization. It comes from, and yes, it's true that like women may or may not have a role in that, but it does kind of, it kind of like almost challenges everything about what we tend to, when we talk about something like a feminist critique of history or something like that, like the role that people had in history is so dependent on the group that they're a part of and their role within that group. And that's that's a lot of what your book is really about, is the role that women had within this Latin Christian elite in the Crusader states.
Yeah.
So
they certainly were part of it. And I think that's a good point, that it was, as I say, often they were financing so a knight or whatever. No, they did not wear armor and joust and do that, which is, again, something of course I fight against all the time. It's this ridiculous notion of women, you have to be equal, you have to do exactly the same thing to have equality. That's not true. You can have an important role that is different from what somebody else does. We all are different. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. We are not identical and interchangeable. But a woman who financed, this is one of my favorite cases, is the Isabella de Schaiva de Montbéliard, who finances a ship so that Henri de Champagne, what do I know? What is it? Jean de Joinville. He lands in Egypt. He's able to land his ships because a woman financed a ship for him. That's an active part. She also financed, she resupplied the castle of Favento on Cyprus when it was under siege. Because of her wealth, she was able to save a fortress from falling to the enemy. I mean, that's significant. And she didn't have to wear armor and ride out and joust to do, with a lance to do it. Okay, maybe we've talked about this enough, but I hope people will look at the book, and I hope if you look at it and read it, write a nice review.
Yeah, I'll write a review for it too, Helena. I'm sorry I haven't done that yet. My excuse is that my wife just had a baby, so
yeah. And it's now Christmas. I know.
Yeah. But yeah, really good book, really interesting, and part of it too is there's just so many interesting women in the historical narrative of the Crusader states. And one of my favorites, of course, is Morphy of Melitene, the wife of Baldwin II, who organized this rescue operation for him when he was that I remember when I was early in my research of the Crusades. That really captured my imagination. I mean, that's just such a great story for one thing. But yeah, so guys, we appreciate everybody who's watching right now. And I know this is, we haven't done this in a while, but let's see if anybody has any questions. And then we'll, before we all start rambling on other topics.
Well, there's been a question up here for a long time. Maybe we should address about folk.
Okay, sure. Let's get to that one. And that was one of the first questions I think we got here.
It was the first question. And it's a great question. And since I've been doing all the talking, why don't you guys answer it?
Well, you might have some interesting stuff to say about this one, Helena. This is from Jonah Verdon.
Yeah.
I have to quickly, he says, what is your assessment of the career of King Fulk of Jerusalem? Good or just mediocre? And I guess I'll start with that. I think he was an excellent king. He kind of became king at a particularly difficult moment in the Kingdom of Jerusalem's history, when you had the rise of Zengi, who established this pretty powerful Turkish state based in Mosul and Aleppo, and was able to kind of create one of the first larger Muslim states that the Crusaders had to, I mean, if we don't count the Fatimids, I guess, but he was a capable king, and he oversaw the building of a lot of castles, and he kind of took this approach of solidifying the frontiers maybe a bit more than had been. Like, there kind of was this phase under Baldwin I and Baldwin II where they were expanding a lot, and Fulk kind of seemed to try to solidify some of the defenses in some respect. I don't know. You guys can give your comments on that too, if you want.
Unfortunately, I have just a very cursory knowledge of him personally. I don't. This isn't something I've gotten too deep in, but I do know that he was pivotal in that period of time that he was in. Marrying, and I really hope I get this right, but he was the one that married Melisandre, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's the one who came from. He was the first one to come from Anjou, not Anjou.
He's from Anjou. He was the Count of Anjou. Yeah.
So and that his interjection that was really him going off to the Holy Land to go become king of Jerusalem and marry Queen Melisandre. Really was, I think, what helped normalize the normalize and strengthen the connection between Christendom, homelands back in Christendom, and Outremer, because here was this very well-known, very powerful, very well-established nobleman from Europe, from France, from central France, and he goes off to go become king of Jerusalem. It was interesting because I know he was actually technically a feudal underlord to King Henry II of England. The Angevin.
He's the grandfather of Henry II.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
he's the grandfather of Henry II.
Son is Morgan. His son. Well, and also that's why technically Hugh was technically a feudal underlord of King Richard I during the Third Crusade, but I think that's where I was getting it mixed up. But yeah, I think it just helped normalize and really brought the idea of a Christian state in Outremer into the consciousness of the average person living in medieval Christendom at the time. As now it was like, we knew that guy. He's now like Fulk of Anjou is now king of Jerusalem. It's like, it almost in a way, I feel like it made it very culturally real for them. And that's why you started seeing such much more involvement, because after the First Crusade and the immediate aftermath, I mean, there was, I think they talk about what the average, like the estimate of the actual knights that stayed behind was possibly not even 2,000. It was like, it was
like 300 or something.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was minuscule.
300 knights.
The Christian Latin presence after in the immediate aftermath of Ascalon was minuscule. And I think once you started having that sort of connection of very powerful noblemen from Christendom continuing on and going off to Outremer and becoming very powerful, even more powerful people over there, I think it just made it more culturally relevant and real to Christendom as a whole. And people started thinking of, oh, that's right, there's Outremer over there too, and that's part of Christendom, So that's my little 2 cents on it. I'm going to shut up because I really don't know a whole lot about this particular topic. So.
And what do you think, Helena?
Well, I would say there's 2 phases to Fulk's reign, because initially he got off to a very, very bad start. He was believed, and William of Tyre, of course, is very keen on this, saying of probably trying to bring people from Anjou and possibly trying to replace Melisandre. They think that he accused her of infidelity with the most highest ranking nobleman of Jaffa, and the idea was to get rid of her and get rid of their joint son, Baldwin III, and to replace them, they thought, possibly with his second son by his first wife, Eustace, and bring him to Outremer. And this resulted in a massive, as of course, Melisandre defended herself with the support of the church, very strong with the support of the church. And the nobility actually lines up behind Melisandre, and they fought Fulk and forced him to completely back down, to the point where, of course, the famous sentence from William of Tyre, where he was afraid to basically sneeze without permission from the queen. It's not quite, you may have that somewhere, J. Stephen, but it's really, he did nothing without her approval, because she had established the point she was legitimate heir. He ruled by right of her, and he may have been crowned, but their son was crowned with them. And she, and he then, after he backs down and accepts the fact, then they had developed a new relationship. The second son, Almeric, is born, but also they start dividing duties in the kingdom. Again, this was a topic in my book somewhat, where he, as you said, was very much active in the foreign affairs and defense of the borders, and she was at home running the country. And because she was such a competent administrator, that worked very well. So he was freed to be out on the front, so to speak, and dealing with the wars, and she could keep the revenues coming in and making sure that everything worked. And there are people who've been written, there's a number of academic works about the corporate kingship and how well this worked in the case of Melisenda and Fulk. So the second half of the reign, after he clarified the fact that he wasn't going to be bringing in his French son, and he wasn't going to be getting rid of the nobles who had fought the first crusade and their descendants, and he was going to live with the situation as it was, that became a very effective second part of his reign.
Yeah, good points there, Helena. That is a really, it is interesting, sort of the conflict that does happen in the royal family between Fulk and Melisende, and then, with Baldwin III. I mean, it continues, after Fulk is dead. I mean, you get this next phase of it, which is this tiff between Baldwin III and
Melisende, yeah.
Melisende, yeah, which, it's one of those things where I do think some historians have pointed to that and said, wow, look at, even this early on, there was all this tension within the Crusader states, and gee, this was just kind of like a prelude to it all kind of, getting taken down by the Saracens. But what's actually kind of interesting about it is the legal jockeying that happens within this framework. I mean, I think kind of one of the essential things that happens, like what you're discussing with Fulk and Melisende, is sort of the assertion of the established nobility and the established crown that sort of gets carried out by Melisende and her faction, and they sort of enforce that. And I think it probably strengthened the government of the kingdom.
And also after the tiff with Baldwin, it's not like she's banned and she's thrown into a convent and she's never heard. No, she's taken over. Later, they clarified, they get over that, and she takes a somewhat backseat to him. She allows him to be sort of more prominent, but she's still controlling a lot of the patronage. She's still attending the parliaments. She's still negotiating treaties. The woman does not disappear. She remains queen. And with his consent, it just, again, they have to work through it. But then it actually is an amazingly strong partnership that evolves. It's quite the opposite to being a faction that falls apart. In both cases, there's temporary tension, as you say, but it doesn't lead to the country being torn apart, let alone invaded or lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of tension was par for the course in a lot of medieval, warrior aristocracies. But
it's still true in any state.
Yeah,
any state has every state has factions and parties and disagreements about policy. There's nothing new about or old or unusual about that.
I think what's maybe a little different is now you don't get like a military demonstration out in front of like the governor's house or something, but yeah, it is kind of, and I think too it's possible to overplay it to some extent. Like I remember when we had what's his name, that was it Professor Donachie? He was on here, and he actually mentioned that we can sort of overemphasize the conflict between Fulk and Melisende, or between Melisende and Baldwin III, and that it was a bit more of just kind of like jockeying for position among the elites. So as they will. I mean, to some extent, it's kind of like it is one of the weaknesses of kind of like having a feudal system or an aristocracy, but there's weaknesses in other types of government too. So it's anyway. But I guess we'll get to some other questions here. Let's see here. We actually had a super chat, so I want to get that one. This is from Kefisat Hadarek. And looking at it, I really don't know if I have an answer, but thank you for the chat. Did Richard III really say if all of his soldiers were Georgian, war would be won easily? Also, did George's St. George flag influence Jerusalem flag? I don't know the answer to any of that, honestly. Helena, do you know what any of that is about?
The Jerusalem flag predates, I'm sure, the George's flag.
Yeah.
The Jerusalem flag, which symbolizes Christ and the 4 apostles, it has nothing to do with Georgia. I have never heard this quote from Richard. I have never seen a source which quotes that. It seems incredibly unlikely for an English king to make a statement like that.
Yeah.
He relied heavily on his English troops, who were some of the best. He also controlled, of course, the entire Angevin Empire, which was troops from Aquitaine and all across most of, obviously, Normandy, Brittany. I can do the whole litany, Gascony. I couldn't even tell you how many Georgians were fought in the Third Crusade, but given the fact that he won the Third Crusade without a lot of Georgian, but with a lot of English troops, I would say no. That quote is completely fictional. And as I say, the crosses of Jerusalem come from Christ and the 4 apostles, and the Jerusalem cross predates any other cross, any other use of those symbols.
Yeah. And then we had, this is a good one from Nathan Burns. What percentage of the Crusader states were Christian when the Crusaders arrived after hundreds of years of Muslim rule? And this is discussed in your other book, Helena.
The course, you can't say states. The states were controlled by Muslims. The question is, what percentage of the population was still Christian within those states which had been conquered by the Muslims? And the answer to that is most historians think it was probably more than 50% of the population in those. That's going to vary by region. You can't say that the same thing is true in Galilee as is true in Accra, or that the same is true in Armenia or up in Edessa, as is true maybe down by Gaza, because there were certain regions of what became the Crusader states where there had been more immigration and more settlement by Muslim, particularly by Bedouins and by Muslim. But the core areas, most of the coastal areas of the Levant remained heavily, if not predominantly, Christian throughout the Muslim period, but they were still Muslim states because they were controlled by Muslim leaders.
Right, yeah. The Northern Crusader states, I mean, the Principality of Antioch was essentially 100% Christian. I mean, it was Armenians and Greeks, and it was a Christian territory. It had been ruled briefly by the Seljuk Turks, who were a tiny Muslim minority ruling all of these Christians. And when the Crusaders came in, they reestablished Christian control. The county of Edessa was almost the same thing. Was almost entirely Armenian.
Yeah, the north and the coast was more heavily Christian than the eastern. If you go east of Jordan and those areas and Sinai, there was more heavily Muslim population.
Right. Yeah, but I think the broader point, and which is one that's in your book about the Crusader states, is that we have to get over this notion that the Crusaders were this tiny Christian minority ruling over just entirely Muslim populations, which is what a lot of people believe even now. I mean, when I get into everyday conversations with people, they don't understand that the Holy Land was at that time still largely Christian. And even today, there are still substantial Christian populations in these regions like Lebanon and Syria, and even in, Israel and all these regions. But yeah, that's something that. And the other thing, too, that is worth mentioning is how well the Eastern Christians living in the Crusader states were treated. They were not oppressed. Like, for example, King Baldwin I of Jerusalem, he made a point of forbidding the Latin clergy from oppressing the Maronites and the Armenians and the Syriac Christians within the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They were allowed to access to the holy sites, the Holy Sepulchre. They were allowed to practice their rites. So, and part of this was there was a political motivation to this, because they needed the cooperation of the Eastern Christians, but Eastern Christians they had a positive role and a lot of freedom to practice their own rights within the Crusader states.
Not just freedom; they were considered completely equal. The garrisons of the towns, the bulk of the army, the mounted archers of the Crusader forces, the bulk of the army of the Crusader troops of the Crusader states were native Christians.
Mm-hmm.
The Armenian, and Syriac, and as you say, leadership. Actually, the Maronites actually combined with Rome briefly at this point, but most of the others had complete equality. They shared churches. Latin lords had used Orthodox confessors. When they take Antioch, they put the Orthodox bishop, patriarch, back on his throne. The crusade was called for by a Byzantine emperor, and with the support of the Byzantine patriarch, the patriarch of Constantinople, who's in constant touch with the Pope. They're making joint press releases as the first crusade advances. The patriarch from the Greek Orthodox on Cyprus sent supplies to the Crusaders when they were besieging Antioch in their greatest hour of need. This is not we tolerated them. This isn't we allowed them to have privileges. The other Christians were treated absolutely equal, with the exception that they were not feudal knights. They were, however, as I said, as mounted archers, and they held other positions within the hierarchy. I'm trying to think. There were constables who were Orthodox. A number of the leading positions in the state were actually traditionally held by Orthodox. And they don't forget that the chief Turcopola, etc., and the Templars and the Hospitallers, they also held very senior positions in the hierarchy of the militant orders.
Right. Yeah, and I think we have to remember too that the Turcoples, these were not like poor people. These would have been a type of elite. These would have been men with of means who.
You had to have the same number of horses as for a lance knight.
Right.
A mounted archer is more skilled than a lanceman.
Yes, these were well-trained elite men of the Eastern Christian background who had a high level role within the Crusader states. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. This is something you and I have talked about a lot, Helena, is that we have to get over this idea that the Crusader states were just this Western project. They were a joint project of the Eastern and Western Christian worlds. And the truth is that there were at the very top levels of the Crusader states, there were people of mixed ancestry. I mean, Jocelyn the First of Edessa married an Armenian woman, and their son became Jocelyn the Second. And the same thing with the royal family.
Well, Baldwin the Third has his mother. Just a minute. It's Morphia.
His grandmother, Morphia.
His grandmother. So, but that what we're saying is that Melisenda is half Armenian.
Right. Yeah. And I know when I visited Israel and I talked to some of the Palestinian Christians there, they have a real affinity for Queen Melisende, or at least a couple of them I met. They really viewed her as kind of like as their queen. In fact, one of them even said that to me. He said, "Oh, you know about our queen?" So I thought that was kind of cool. Yeah. So let's see here.
I see a question here about reaction of Christendom to the sacking of Sara in the Fourth Crusade, and I think it's important to raise this. The Fourth Crusade was not a crusade. It was condemned by the Pope. It was considered, the leaders of the Fourth Crusade were excommunicated. All right, please hear that. The Pope excommunicated the leaders of the mercenary expedition which sacked Sara and went on to sack Constantinople. It was not considered a crusade. We call it anachronistically. Historians have called it a crusade. At the time, it was condemned vehemently by the church hierarchy, and many of the Christian noblemen who had signed up for the crusade when they realized that there was going to be sacking a Christian city, left the crusade, one of the most prominent among them being Simon de Montfort and his brother Guy, who then travel independently to the Holy Land to try to fight there. So this is not, it was not a crusade, and it was condemned. What happens, of course, and this is, of course, the reality of politics is once they were successful, once the mercenaries led by Venice had succeeded against all the odds of taking Constantinople, the Pope was very happy to then accept it and to set up a Christian state. So that, you know, sort of the fait accompli, and once the end justifies the means, and all of a sudden, oh yes, well, we'll now take over. But the reality is when they first started, and certainly the sack of Sara, which was the question, was vehemently condemned by the church, and many men refused to take part in it. Others didn't necessarily have that choice. Many people sold everything they had and had gone in crusade and didn't have a lot of money, and they were they had sold their soul to the Venetians, because the Venetians were supposed to provide had built the ships, and they couldn't pay for them. All right, the leaders of the crusade had asked Venice to provide the bottoms to transport them to the Holy Land, and when they got to Venice, they didn't have the money to pay, and that's what put them in debt to Venice, and why they were working off their debt by fighting for Venice. But it was not a crusade.
Yeah, it's I think that it has to be viewed too in kind of the context of the political struggle between Venice and the Byzantine Empire that was going on at that time. And also, you know, things that had happened in Byzantium led to this situation. I mean, when you had Emperor Emmanuel in power, who had a policy of supporting the Crusader states, and you know, a lot of his leading generals were Franks, and you know, that there was cooperation between the two. That was very beneficial to both Constantinople and to Jerusalem. But you had, you know, after he died, you had like this revolution in the palace. You had, you know, the murder of the heir. You had the blinding of his widow. I mean,
and the slaughter of the Venetian community, and they men and women, and going into the churches and killing the preachers on the feasts at the altar. It was horrible. I mean, there's no, the Venetians had a, I'm not saying they were justified, but they had cause for their anger. That still doesn't make it a crusade. The fact that Venice, the Doge of Venice, wanted revenge against the Byzantines is something, as I say, you can look into it and follow. It still doesn't make it a crusade.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the other thing too to consider is during the Third Crusade, the Byzantines took just an outright hostile attitude toward the Crusader state, and they could, you know, the emperor was willing to make an alliance with Saladin. They attacked the German emperor, who was just trying to, you know, pass through the territory. So I don't know. I think that we have to be careful about kind of taking the Stephen Runciman perspective on the Fourth Crusade, which has been another.
There's a whole backstory to it. But I do think the question actually was about Sara, and Sara is not Byzantium, and it was condemned.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
You know, that was a Venetian pure power grab. I don't, unless you know something, you're being very quiet. I don't know of any reason that what it would have justified taking Crusaders against Sara.
Oh yeah, I think it was completely, you know, unjustified, and that was the point when most of the people left. I think that's when Simon of Montfort left, and I mean, that's actually kind of the striking thing about the quote unquote Fourth Crusade is the scruples that are demonstrated throughout it. I mean, it really, you know, they really whittled down the army, you know, with these successive diversions of the crusade, and it kind of just, it shows, and then the fact that, you know, the church, you know, it's not like the Pope just said, oh great, you know, yeah, just grab Constantinople. I mean, it really does show that there was a lot of sensitivity, you know, among both the nobility and the church about how a crusade was properly supposed to function. Like this idea that, like, you know, crusading was just about like well, call it a crusade and go conquer whatever you can. I mean, is obviously not what, was going on, or that's not how it was viewed by, the powers that be at the time. So, okay. So yeah, we're getting a lot of questions now. So I know as you get into a stream, usually more and more people kind of jump in. So we have a couple of just nice comments. So I appreciate that from Magnus Horus. So Helena, actually, let's take a minute. What are you working on in terms of upcoming projects for you? Just
nothing of relevance to this group.
Oh, okay.
Well, but what about your book? Wait a minute. Well, J. Stephen, you're the one. Your book should be we've been waiting for it for a long time. When is it going to come out?
I mean, everything is done for it. I'm just giving it one last read through, and then it'll be out very soon. Like I've got all the graphics done, the maps, all that stuff. So and I'm really excited about it too. I mean, I'm really proud of this book. I'm not going to write another one for a long time, but I really do. I don't know. As you know, I love the Third Crusade. I love King Richard. And I do really feel like I kind of took a lot of my research and a lot of my dedication to that and put it into something that I do think is worthwhile. And I really am proud of the book, and I'm excited to get it out. So yeah, next year will be the year of the book.
Did you see the cartographer, I'm forgetting his name, who was in touch with him? Did you see? He did some wonderful maps. Really beautiful.
Yes. And I need to get back in touch with him. Yes. He did some awesome stuff.
We should do a whole session on that. I think because he really did a beautiful job.
I agree. Absolutely. I'm going to have to, there's so many stuff I have to go back and look over again. But again, my excuse is we had another baby this year. So that is quite a project, having another kid. So, but yeah, that's been great too. We're really happy with our new little baby. So she's doing really well.
Good.
So, okay. Yeah, let's do a few more questions here, guys. Rand had to jump off. I know he's kind of semi-working today, so that's okay. Let's see here. Let's see if we can find something that really jumps out at me that I really want to answer here. Any that you're seeing that you like, Helena?
No, it's interesting. When medieval had more power than 18th century, a lot more power. Let me tell you, please read my book. You can get it all outlined for you there.
Yeah. Somebody
asked, have you ever read God's Wolf by Jeffrey Lee? It's terrible.
I've never read it, Helena. You've read it, and it's terrible.
Oh yeah, it's terrible.
Okay, interesting. Is he a specialist, or is he more of just?
No, he's a journalist.
He's a journalist.
And he really plays fast and loose with the sources. He takes the tidbits that he likes and uses them and tries to make, it's heroic when Chatillon makes a charge, but if Balin de Evelyn makes a charge, that was stupid. It's just, I wrote a review of that. I could pull it up somewhere. It really is very sensationalist. They're very biased, and no, it's not worth reading.
Well, I'm glad I didn't waste my time then, because I've seen it here and there. But it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I do think it's amazing how when somebody's kind of like a journalist or something and they write a book about the Crusades, how often it's disappointing. I mean, not always, but yeah, I think Bernard Hamilton was going to put something out about Reynald, and then I think Paul Crawford told us a while back that he was going to try to take up that project. But yeah, Reynald of Chatillon is an interesting figure in history. He I think the big question is always like, okay, well, was he generally beneficial to the Crusader states, or was he harmful to them? And his career there's definitely room for debate there, I think. But he definitely had a role in Baldwin IV's administration, in which he was a part of that. I know Paul Crawford has told me a couple of times that he thinks that, especially when he was younger, Baldwin relied on Reynald as one of his advisors. He could be kind of a thug at times too, though. I mean, I think that's fair.
I know. I mean, the attack of Cyprus is nonsense, and alienating the Byzantine emperor. There's a lot of things. On the other hand, his attack in the Red Sea was brilliant, and he cut the Saladin off. I mean, he at a really important time he forced Saladin to leave off his attack of Aleppo and come back to defend the routes to Mecca, and therefore, delayed the time when Saladin unified the Muslim states and made him, basically invincible. So that Renaud de Chardin was not stupid.
Right.
He, as I say, he was, but he put his own interests ahead of those of the kingdom. Certainly after he'd helped put Guy de Lusignan on the throne, and Lusignan was not strong enough to say no to him, and that's really you get through. He plays a role in the disintegration of the kingdom, because by saying that he wouldn't take orders from Baldwin, Guy de Lusignan, and just asserting his right, he basically tries to set up his principality at Transjordan or the Ultra Jordan as an independent kingdom, and that's disastrous for a kingdom that's as weak as the kingdom of Jerusalem was. So as you say, I think that there's a lot of reasons for criticizing Chatillon, but that doesn't deny the fact that some of the things he did were also very brilliant and strategically sound.
Yeah, very fair. I think that's a fair assessment of it. Let's see here.
I like this question, but why didn't the Byzantine emperors help more with the Crusades?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a really key question about the fact that the Byzantine emperors considered the entire Levant, and in fact Egypt and things, part of their empire. Remember, they're the heirs to the Holy of Rome, and therefore all that Rome, ancient Rome, held, they considered as their legitimate territories. And the reconquest of the Holy Land was as much for them about territorial control of their empire as it was about a holy war. They did not have a tradition of holy war. The Byzantine, the Orthodoxy, did not have knights in the same way. They didn't have the tradition of just war that comes up with Augustine. Their tradition is different, and they had a much more ambiguous and skeptical attitude towards the use of arms for Christianity. There was no tradition they did not join in the crusading tradition at all. They didn't basically they didn't buy into crusading, a holy war.
I also think
go
ahead. Well, I was just going to say that the politics in Constantinople were so inward focused, and there was a lot of difficulty that the Byzantine emperors had in maintaining their power. I mean, mm-hmm. especially after the death of Basil II, especially kind of the traditional administrative structure of the Byzantine Empire collapsed at that point, and you had these competing families, and the place where they competed was Constantinople, and it was kind of this contest of who could hold power and who could and that was constantly in everybody's mind. I mean, and that's kind of the interesting thing about the situation of the Byzantine emperors, especially as compared to like in the Crusader states, where like the legalism was a lot clearer, like who had what role. And I think that just, the transmission of power just functioned a lot more smoothly there. Whereas mm-hmm. in Constantinople, the Byzantine emperors, they couldn't really branch out that much. They were more bound to, like, that's why Alexius I didn't leave to help the first Crusaders. At least that's what he said. He told the Crusaders is that he feared for the safety of his empire if he joined them in the crusade. Well, he was talking about, he was worried he might lose his, which is fascinating when you think about that.
Well, you look at the number of emperors that were assassinated, etc. You can't.
Right. and compare that to like Richard I of England, who goes on crusade, he's imprisoned in Germany and never loses his throne. I mean, It's just there was a problem in Constantinople with the soundness of of the government. I mean, it really, like, its ability to, like, to function and for an emperor to maintain power. And that is kind of the theme throughout the era of the Crusades.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I say those are the two factors. So that when they were strong, like we had a strong emperor like Manuel, he did actually help the Crusaders. But very much the 4 attacks on Egypt that they did jointly was very much about regaining Byzantine power. It wasn't really in the sense of crusading. And the as you say, and at other times the emperors just were too weak to do anything, or outright supported, as you say, Saladin against the Crusaders because I don't know, they thought it was in their interest. I mean,
they thought it was politic at the moment, but I mean, at that point, after Manuel is dead,
they saw Constantinople as more important than Jerusalem. The church in Constantinople and the patriarch of Constantinople was to them more important than Jerusalem. Jerusalem was always for them a province, not the center of Christendom. Whereas in the Latin Church, Jerusalem was the center of Christendom.
Yes, yeah, and you can really understand that when you read the source material, like like for example, Anna Komnena, the way she talks about Jerusalem, it's nothing like the way Latin writers talk about Jerusalem. It's a different conception of Christianity. That's a really good point. So so let's do a couple more questions, and then we'll sort of start wrapping things up. I'm going to. This is interesting. Did the Crusades help to bring more unity to the Eastern and Western Christians, or did it bring more division? It brought more unity.
Yes.
Because the Crusader states were better at protecting Eastern Christians than the Byzantines had been. So
I would agree. And there's some marvelous quotes after the fall of the Crusader states, where they talk about our countries, our armies being defeated, where the Armenian
Michael
and
the Syrian.
Very, very strong identification with the Crusader states, and there was less infighting between the various Eastern religions under the Crusader states. Interesting. It's hard to say why. Maybe just because they were distracted by the bigger picture, because they weren't fighting with each other as much. Maybe because the Muslims had used the divisions between the various Christian states to try to divide and conquer, and the Latin rulers just didn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was a lot bigger deal for the Patriarch of Constantinople. Like, clearly there was more, like, that's one thing actually when you read Byzantine chroniclers, there's this emphasis on, these heretics, the Armenians are heretics, the Syrians are heretics, and that was a big deal. Whereas the Crusaders took this attitude of, like, and I think that's in Michael the Syrian. He says that the Franks do not divide among the various. As long as you follow the cross, they consider you a Christian.
As long as they honor the cross, they consider you a Christian. That's it.
Yeah. And I think some of that had to do with the fact that, the emperors themselves viewed themselves as the head of the church. And I mean, I think they effectively were. And so it's kind of like these other rights were kind of a challenge to the authority of the emperor. Whereas if you're the king of Jerusalem, you look at it like, okay, well, there's the church, and then I'm the king. And then these other groups, I want them. I want their help. I want them here. So I'm going to.
I need them.
Embrace them. Yeah. So interesting.
Jerusalem was defended by the native Christians, as you say. There are only the 300 knights and a 1,000 footmen, and without the support of the native Christians, Jerusalem would have fallen long before. In 1100, 1102. Because there wasn't time. The settlers eventually come from the west, and they become a sixth of the population. Yes, but in the early years, the kingdom depended entirely upon the native Christians.
Yeah, I mean, Baldwin the First brought thousands of Eastern Christians into his territory. So,
that's the other thing. They invited also Christians in from the territories from Syria, So Christians left the Muslim-held territory and moved into the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And the Christians that were already there supported the kingdom. And then, of course, there were Western settlers as well. But as you say, there were people moved to Christians and Jews. Jews left Egypt to go and live in the Kingdom of Jerusalem because it was a better place for Jews.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. I read a Jewish chronicler not too long ago who talked about some of the Jewish communities like in Tyre and Acre, and they were there too. So they had synagogues, and there were Muslim communities in those cities as well. So,
but the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a leading place for Talmudic studies in the 13th century.
Yeah,
it was one of the 3 leading places, along with Spain, and I don't know where else. Egypt, probably.
Interesting. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. The Jews fled Western Europe and the pogroms in Western Europe and went to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, went to the Crusader states because they were more tolerant of Jews.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't allowed to live in Jerusalem itself, but they were in other cities. And
as you say, Accra was the entire. That's a big major part in the book about the kingdoms at the crossroads, looking at the Jewish and the Muslim communities and the native Christian communities.
And then we got a chat from Matthew here who says, Mrs. Schrader and Mr. Stephen, did a meteor kill a historical figure, king, prince, or someone related to the Crusades?
Not that I know of.
I've never heard of that. I'm sorry, Matthew.
There's a question for you, J. Stephen. It's why did King Richard not march on Jerusalem? Since you've just written the book about the Third Crusade, you want to take that one?
Okay. Yeah, I'll try not to talk too much about it, but I think personally, like to summarize it, I think Richard was a planner above all else. And it's kind of interesting because we talk about, he's the Lionheart. He just rushed into battle. He wasn't like that at all. I mean, Richard was somebody who thought about a situation ahead of time and organized it and tried to figure out what was going to work and what wasn't. And I think that when it came to Jerusalem, he was very concerned about some of the unknowns. And, he talked to the local Crusader lords. He talked with the Templars and the Hospitallers. And another thing about Richard is he was somebody who knew whose advice was worth listening to. And he heeded the advice of a lot of the local veterans on that topic. And I think that he thought that there were too many risks. And the other thing too is I think he thought that if even if he did capture Jerusalem, the issue was going to be holding it. And he sort of came to this conclusion early on that he wanted to conquer Egypt before he went after Jerusalem. He wanted to take out Saladin's power center in Egypt. So, like any great general, I think that Richard understood that warfare is about logistics and not strategy, principally. And his concern was how to keep his army supplied, once he moved it away from the coast. So I think that was the issue with Jerusalem. I think it was the right decision, personally. With the forces that he had, he achieved the most that he possibly could have for the Crusader states and left them in a better situation than he found them. So what do you think, Helena?
I agree with that. I agree with Target. I mean, the idea of trying to take Jerusalem with an army and that then disintegrates and there's nobody who can hold it, it's ridiculous. Saladin had reinforced the city, and Balian Ebelin's with the army and knows exactly how you can hold that city against a much larger force.
Right. I think
he knew. I think Saladin had Balian had 2 knights, 80 boys, and 50 women for every man within the city, and he still fought for 3 weeks or whatever. But Saladin had crack troops in the city, and they were advancing in winter the first time, and it's no way they could have taken and held Jerusalem. But
I think the icing on the cake was you know, the opinion of the Templars and the Hospitallers and the Poulain lords. I mean, I think that Richard just took that very seriously, and that was their opinion. I mean, there's a passage in Ibn Shaddad where he talks about, you know, one of their spies listening in on, you know, a conversation that they were having about this, and that's basically what was said, was that Richard was talking to the Duke of Burgundy, and the Duke of Burgundy was like, you know, wanting to do this, and Richard was saying, well, how are we going to keep, you know, the army supplied with water? And the Duke of Burgundy came up with something that was just crazy, like, you know, have these trips back and forth to this well, and Richard was just looking at him, just saying, that's completely crazy. I mean, that's not going to work. And so, yeah, Richard he thought before he did things, which any successful military commander in history does that. You know, it's kind of funny that people think of him as like this berserker, or this raging, just this guy who like just got mad and rushed into battle. I mean, it's just absolutely the opposite of the truth. I mean, just not at all. So, okay, how about one more question, then we'll wrap up for now. Let's see here. Get your questions in now, guys, while I'm scrolling through them. If you see one you like, Helena, just let me know.
Well, I just saw somebody talking about how were women more powerful. We certainly can't go into that in the 18th century. We can't go into that here. I read my book, you'll see a lot of what they had, and then you can compare it to your knowledge of the 18th century. But it starts with just being able to inherit and, as I say, have trades and control inheritance and wealth. And by the 18th century, women often couldn't do anything without the permission of their husband. That's not true in the Middle Ages. Very simple things like that. But as I say, it's the easiest thing to do is read the book and then compare it to what you know about the 18th century.
And Jonathan, we'll tell you congratulations on your new baby. Awesome. Congratulations. So Chris here asks, is there a reason why Fernando III of Castile seems like an underrated king in medieval history? That's a good point. I mean, he's probably one of the most successful kings of the High Middle Ages. He's the one who took Cordoba and Sevilla from the Muslims, so one of the big Reconquista kings.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it probably is just that Spain is sort of underrepresented in English-speaking discussions of history. And, you know, medieval Spain has a lot of interesting stuff, especially like if you like the Crusades, you're gonna like medieval Spain, because it's kind of a parallel story, except it went the other direction. But okay. All right. Well, I guess let's kind of wrap up for now, everybody. This has been great. I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Yes, and
absolutely.
Helena, I'm really glad you got to do this with us, all the way coming to us from across the other side of the world.
Not quite. The other side of the pond.
Right. Yeah. It's great to have you here.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
And yeah, we'll try to do more live streams when we get into 2025. Everybody, that'll be sort of a New Year's resolution for me.
And let's include our cartographer, because I think if we showed some of those pictures, people might find it really interesting, and that will also trigger some good questions about just the geography of the area.
Absolutely, yeah.
And how that impacted.
Yeah, and that's actually it's interesting. That's a thing about history. When you look at a map, especially a map that shows more of the lay of the land as opposed to just the political separations, that kind of really helps explain a lot more about history too. So I absolutely agree with that. I think we need to do that. So yeah, Merry Christmas to everybody, and we will be with you again, hopefully before too long. And with that, I will say goodbye for now.
Right. Merry Christmas.